Good afternoon. This is the program on constitutional government at Harvard, where it's gloomy Friday the 13th in Cambridge. Rain is falling. Cambridge itself is somewhat disappointed, but still glad that the tyrant has been voted out, if not expelled. We'll see. And our guest today is Jack Goldsmith. Look at his face carefully, and you will see a keen eye and a relaxed smile. The keen eye speaks lawyer, and the relaxed smile speaks professor. So he's the learned hand professor of law at Harvard Law School. And he's also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He served in the government, in the executive branch, in the Department of Justice, and also in the Department of Defense in the George W. Bush administration. So he's a law professor with experience in politics, which is rare. He's a professor in constitutional law with a view to politics. And it's not a question of mere advocacy for him, given his experience and the way he's developed his experience. His books show the strength and sophistication of his political judgment. The first one mentioned several, The Terror Presidency, that's George W. Bush, The Power of Constraint, The Accountable Presidency, In the Shadow of Hoffa, which is separate, and a wonderful read, and a wonderful family experience of his. And The Failure of the Internet, or of internet freedom, I mean. And the book that he's just coming out now with, After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. And this he's done with Bob Bauer, who was an official in the Obama administration. And this leads me to mention his website, Lawfare, of which he was a founder. And its main character is, it's bipartisan. Jack Goldsmith is almost about the only conservative professor at Harvard Law School now. And he's also the most bipartisan. So he upholds one end of the partisan spectrum and at the same time keeps the balance, so to speak, with his other hand. So this is Jack Goldsmith, and he's going to talk about his new book, After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. Jack.
Thank you, Harvey. Can everybody hear me? Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to speak for a bit about this new book. I'm just going to outline what it's about and and talk about some of the reforms. Then I'm going to say a few things about just some issues coming up during the transition, and then we can open it up to questions. So this new book came out in September. It's called After Trump. It's as Harvey said, it's written with Bob Bauer, who was Barack Obama's White House counsel. Bob and I got to know one another once he left the government through a variety of academic circles. We had originally thought about writing a book about the White House counsel itself, the office of lawyers in the White House. There's no good analysis of that office. He had served there. I had worked with the White House counsel heavily when I was in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department. In the course of outlining that book, which was about 18 months ago, we decided we just kept coming back to the Trump presidency and what the Trump presidency had revealed about the 1970s reforms of the presidency, the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, post-Church Commission reforms of the presidency, what it had revealed about the weaknesses of those and failures and successes of those reforms. We came to the conclusion that there was going to be, when Trump left the scene because of behavior, which I'm not going to get into, but which I'm happy to talk about if it's not obvious. We decided that we judged that there was going to be a massive debate about reform of the presidency once Trump left the scene, whether in 2021 or 2025. So we wrote this book to try to participate in that debate, to frame the debate. There's there are many dozens of reform proposals. I'll go through some of the topics in a second. The book is designed, we have views, we have lots of concrete views which we offer, but the book is designed to kind of set a framework for reform. So while we have views about what we think should happen, we give lots of historical background and legal background that we hope will be useful for these discussions, whether people agree with our particular reforms or not. A few comments about the project of reform. So Bob and I both believe in a powerful presidency. These reforms are many, but they're not designed to, this is a qualitative judgment, obviously, they're not designed to chop down the presidency in any significant way. They're designed to, they're actually, most of them are retail level suggestions. Some of them are quite unambitious. Some of them are more ambitious. But the aim is to make the presidency more accountable and to create and to, which is a weasel word, I'll admit, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, to basically explore what Trump revealed about the presidency and what we think needs to be fixed about the presidency in light of the Trump experience. Now, before I get into some of the reforms, there are a whole bunch of objections to the project that one might have. One objection is, why focus on the presidency? Why not focus on Congress or the electoral system? Isn't the problem with the presidency really a problem of Congress or a problem of the electoral system or a problem of the press? Yes, perhaps, probably. I think that if there was one institution that I could magically fix in our government, it would be Congress, not the presidency, because I think that the root of many of our governmental problems lies in a feckless Congress rather than an overambitious president, which is not to say that there's not an overpowerful president. But we don't think, first of all, we're not scholars of the Congress of the presidency, and we think that reform of the presidency is more likely to be consequential. And so that's where we focused our efforts, acknowledging that there are all sorts of other reforms one may do to the U.S. governmental system to improve it along whatever lines one thinks needs to be improved. A word about law versus norms. A lot of our, so they're based, and this audience, I'm sure, understands the distinction, but I'll just briefly state that norms are the non-legal expectations of behavior that do a lot of governance within the executive branch. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but the main one is one important reason why executive branch behaviors need to be governed by norms is because the Constitution probably doesn't permit certain regulations. So, for example, there's this hugely tricky question, which is not a new one, about how the president, who's vested with all of the executive power and who's charged with the duty to take care to faithfully execute the law, which means that he has supervisory authority over law enforcement. What do you do when the president or a senior official engages in possibly criminal action? How does one investigate that consistent with the idea that the president is in charge of the executive branch? And since the 70s, a whole bunch of norms and regulations have grown up to try to deal with that problem. Some of them in the Special Counsel regulations, which replaced the failed post-Watergate experiment with the independent counsel statute. Some of them with just basically norms of separation between the Justice Department and the White House in certain types of cases. So norms necessarily have to govern a lot of presidential behavior. Some of our proposals, which I'll get to in a second, suggest that some norm-based restrictions be transferred into law-based ones. In case, just to preempt, or at least to preemptively engage those of you who are skeptical about norms and whether they actually have bite or efficacy in regulating the presidency, I think that they've had remarkable bite even in the Trump administration. In fact, the experience with the Trump administration has, I think, shown the efficacy of norms more plainly, and also the weakness of norms, I should add, but the efficacy of norms more plainly than any prior administration. Consider volume 2 of the Mueller report, which shows that President Trump tried through several mechanisms to get numerous senior close subordinates, including his White House counsel and some of his close political subordinates, to persuade the Justice Department to fire or stop Mueller. One episode after another, and they were just insubordinate, basically. They didn't listen to him. Now, this is one of many examples where Trump was a feckless president who didn't understand how to wield executive power. It's another topic we can talk about. But the question is, why didn't they? And their answer is because that we don't know. They haven't testified about this yet. But the answer was clearly a combination of concern about legal liability plus these norms of non-interference that have been driven into the culture of of certainly the Justice Department and even the lawyers working in the White House. If you think other examples where there should be a puzzling explanation for those of you who think norms don't have any impact, why is it that after 4 years of relentless insistence by the president that his senior officials prosecute or investigate his enemies, that we didn't see any prosecutions? Why is it that President Trump is extremely angry with Attorney General Barr, the supposed lackey for the president in carrying out his wishes, and implying that he might fire him because he's not doing enough to go after his enemies? In this and many other circumstances, we've seen the president utterly disregarding the norms of independence of the Justice Department. But we've seen those norms nonetheless be efficacious for people below him in the White House and the Justice Department. So against that background, I mean, if I need to explain, let me just explain some of our reforms and why we think they're needed. So, and I'm just going to mention some. I'm going into a little bit of depth on some that I think are most likely to be successful, i.e., they're plausible. It's plausible they'll be implemented. The first set of reforms has to do with financial conflicts of interest. President Trump, for 50 years since Watergate, every president and presidential candidate has disclosed tax reforms and complied with the conflict of interest statute, even though the statute doesn't bind the president. In the 1970s, I think it was, yes, the 1970s, Assistant Attorney General Antonin Scalia issued an opinion where he said, well, of course, the conflict of interest statute doesn't apply to the president because it doesn't specify him. But of course, he said, every president would want to comply with these and will comply with these, so it doesn't make any difference. And that was the expectation. That was the norm for 50 years, which Trump has just persistently violated. So basically, I can get into the details if you want, but we propose that these norms about tax disclosure and conflict of interest rules be embodied in enforceable laws so that presidents in the future can't do what Trump did. And essentially, the problem here, it's obvious, but I'll state it briefly, is the president has massive personal commercial interests that are influenceable. It can be influenced by and enhanced by his public actions. And there have been many, many suggestions throughout the Trump presidency that this is what's going on. And this is corrosive to the public interest and to figuring out whether the president is acting in the public interest or lining his pockets. So that we think should be a relatively easy reform. There's legislation teed up in the House of Representatives. It's not clear if McConnell will want to do that, but there should be significant support for that among Republicans when Trump is gone from the scene. There already is for some. Second basket of reforms, which I think should be relatively easy, are cleaning up the rules on foreign interference in elections. This is the second election where we had to worry about this, and Bob and I go through the gaps in the law and propose ways to ensure that foreign governments especially can't enter into basically agreements with one candidate to try to undermine the other candidate. That's the thrust of the reforms. A third basket of reforms has to do with the pardon power. I'll be very brief here. Most people think that the pardon power is absolute and that Congress can't regulate it. We don't think that's right. The president can pardon whomever he wants for whatever reason, but that doesn't mean it can't constitute a separate crime. So if the president accepts a bribe in exchange for a pardon, we think that can be subject to criminal punishment and should be. If the president gives a pardon in exchange for obstruction of justice, to suborn, to tamper with evidence or suborn perjury, we think that can be subject to criminal penalties, and we think that it should be subject to criminal penalties to sort of take off the table and dissuade some of those pardons, the likes of which I think we're going to see. We've already seen one possible example of that. I'm not saying it is an example with Roger Stone, and I think we're going to see a lot more in the transition. Another set of reforms, and I'll stop here and then I'll just list the others, has to do with, there's a whole series of reforms having to do with rule of law stuff. And this is very complicated. We have 5 chapters on it. Complicated, the relationship between the Justice Department and the White House and law enforcement. It's very hard to summarize our proposals here. I'll just say 2 or 3 things. We do think that Congress should specify the circumstances in which the President of the United States can commit obstruction of justice. We think that narrowly targeted statute like that is constitutional. It's a very tricky issue because, as I said at the outset, the President is charged with supervising law enforcement. And so, in some sense, any action he takes vis-a-vis law enforcement has a flavor of Article 2 about it. And so the question is, can Congress actually regulate if the President orders a law enforcement action to try to obstruct justice as it's traditionally understood? We proposed a statute that's fairly narrowly defined to try to get at that. On the other hand, there are lots of problems in this area, and I'll just mention, we have one chapter on problems in the bureaucracy. There was a major problem. I'm not telling anyone in this event anything they don't know. Major problems both with the investigation of the Hillary Clinton email campaign, the way that it was concluded, the Comey announcement in July of 2016, the reopening of the investigation right before the election revealed an absence of guidance on these hugely important issues, both norms or law, about how to conduct investigations and what the rules were and what the responsibilities of the Attorney General were in conducting those investigations. And the same thing, not the same thing, but the analogous thing happened in the investigation by the FBI also of the Trump campaign. We had, once again, an opening of a counterintelligence investigation that I don't think was legally predicated. We had an opening of a criminal investigation without any guidance. We had decisions of this magnitude being made in the FBI rather than in the Attorney General's office, where there's political accountability. So we have a whole bunch of reforms to try to put that on a better footing. So these aren't all kind of anti-Trump reforms. I'm going to stop there on the reform front. I'll just mention the topics: foreign state influence, financial conflicts of interest, tax disclosure, the press, the pardon power, Justice Department independence, the special counsel, the bureaucracy against the president, investigating past administrations, the White House counsel, war powers and nuclear weapons, vacancies reform, and emergency powers. So that's our landscape. I'll say one last thing, and then I'll say a few words about transition. Bauer and I came to this project not knowing what we would agree on. I mean, we have political differences, and we come at these issues from kind of different ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, so to speak. But we were able. It was an enormously enriching and fun project, and we had tons of deliberation, and we reached consensus on everything except one thing. And I'll just mention it. If you want to pursue it more in the conversation, we can. That is the fate of Donald Trump once he leaves office. And to make a long story short, Bob's view is that there should be a full investigation of his potential criminal activities. His argument in a nutshell is that, as you may well know, the Justice Department has a rule that the President of the United States cannot be indicted or prosecuted while in office. And Bob's view is that if he isn't prosecuted after office for crimes committed in office, then he basically has a get out of jail free card, and he literally is above the law, and that can't be right. That's a powerful argument. My view is more pragmatic, or based in pragmatic considerations. First of all, it's not at all clear to me what crimes Trump has committed. The most obvious one is obstruction of justice. John Bolton, who's no liberal slouch, claimed that President Trump committed obstruction of justice as a way of life. That's a quote, as a way of life. But there are serious legal problems under the current statutes, which is why we call for reform, serious legal deficiencies and difficulties in prosecuting a president of the United States for obstructing justice. I don't think those can succeed. And I haven't seen yet any other plausible legal claim that I think can succeed. I think the process of the investigation, which will not be limited to Trump, the process of one administration using the lens of criminal law to investigate the prior administration would be deeply corrosive to our democratic culture, would be deeply preoccupying for the Biden administration. It would look vindictive to at least half the country, no matter how unbiased and no matter how much integrity it had. I believe it would set a terrible precedent that would come on top of the Barr-Durham investigation of the previous administration. And I just think it would be terrible for our, what I'll call our democratic culture. And I think it would end in failure and therefore be self-defeating. So those are, in a nutshell, the reasons I don't think it's a good idea. That said, President Biden is going to, and his attorney general are going to be under enormous pressure to investigate Trump and members of his staff, at least in the White House, if not in the Justice Department. I have a whole parade of horribles in the book that I think will come to pass. And I unfortunately think that we're going to see in real life whether my predictions are right, because I think there will be an investigation, a serious criminal investigation of Trump by the next administration. Quickly on the transition, I want to be clear, I am not an election law scholar. So if you have questions about election law, I'm not going to be able to give you great answers. I can say this, everything I've looked at thus far makes it crystal clear that Biden is going to be the president on January 20th. I haven't seen any plausible argument that that's not going to happen. I don't think that there's going to be a coup. I think that is the same kind of just sort of wild overreaction to Trump's admittedly discombobulating antics that we've seen for 4 years. That said, I do think it's a very dangerous period, and I do think Trump will wield his admitted presidential powers in a way that it's going to be discombobulating. He's going to, I predict, exercise the pardon power famously, in unprecedentedly aggressive ways. I think he'll pardon the Trump organization, everyone involved in all the current investigations, his family, anyone involved in the executive branch who's under conceivable criminal jeopardy. And I think for the first time, we'll have a president who pardons himself. We'll see. Whether a self-pardon is constitutional or not is an entirely unanswered question. Scholars are divided on that, so that might be a first. I think there's a serious danger of Trump ordering the disclosure of classified information. The scope of that is unclear, but the president has full prerogative to disclose whatever classified information he wants. The entire classified information system is built on presidential power, and the president has complete discretion to declassify whatever he wants. I think that we're going to see more and more of the firings like we saw last week of the defense secretary and some very important senior officials in the Defense Department. Towards what end, it's just not clear. We can imagine a whole bunch of things, bad things that might happen. It could, or good things, depending on your viewpoint. Some people think Trump is doing this because he wants a quick withdrawal from Afghanistan. And if you think that's a good thing, then you would support the moves he made in the Defense Department. Some people think it's about ensuring that he can disclose secrets or classified information that he wants to. Some people worry that they're preparing the military to be rolling out in the streets. I'm confident that's not going to happen. But I think we're going to see, maybe FBI director Wray fired and have an interim FBI director to Trump's liking, CIA director fired. By the way, the firing of Chris Wray, if it happens, would be a great gift to Joe Biden, because Wray is in the second or third year of a 10-year term, and it would be awkward for Biden to fire him. So as long as we can get through the transition, I'm sure Biden would not be unhappy with that. Trump is going to do, who knows what he'll do with the emergency power or the war power in the interim. I can't predict, but I do think it's going to be a very, very disruptive period, and it's going to be make a lot of people very anxious. And but I think we'll get through it. And for better or worse, Joe Biden will be president on January 20th. And I'll stop there and take your questions.
Can I start with one?
Sure.
On the distinction between law and norms.
Mm-hmm.
What you just said about the transition suggests that the main feature of Trump's presidency was violation of law, not so much of norms. Because if you're talking about criminal investigations, that implies laws. And So, but I want to raise a picture of Trump as a demagogue as opposed to criminal. I'm trying to put words into his mouth as to what he might say, or a defender of his might say, in regard to what you said against him, or what anyone might say against him. And I don't mean that I'm taking his side, but still, as a demagogue, his technique has been to seek an immediate relationship with the people. So he's comes from reality TV. His picture of the people is something like a TV audience that you can address personally and directly, and that's what he does with his tweets. Now, that, it seems to me, is a certain kind of accountability. The word demagogue means acting on behalf of the people. And the way it's first described in Plato and Aristotle is not somebody who is authoritarian, but who is carrying out the authoritarian character of the people. So the demagogue is an especially democratic character and not an authoritarian character in the sense of against democracy. And the demagogue brings out, you might say, the authoritarian nature of democracy. So if you're trying to be president by addressing the people immediately, you're against the kind of norms and laws which require elites of bureaucrats and well-educated people to establish or enforce, and so you're getting around them and going directly to the. So that's a kind of accountability which is very different from what people mean by the accountability of either laws or norms. Laws or norms could both be understood as a form of due process, but due process is a way of putting a distance between the president and the people. And Trump's way was always to, seemingly with deliberate intent. I mean, again, I don't want to put philosophy into his mind or mouth, but with deliberate intent to violate. And what impresses people is violation or sensation. That's what they like. If you mean by being accountable to what they like or what impresses them, then it would be perhaps above all this sort of anti-due process sentiment. So what would you say to this kind of general view?
So I accept it, and I mean, just to be clear, if I wasn't clear, I do not believe that Trump's major sins have to do with law breaking. I mean, the fact it's very hard to, and you can make the case that his two immediate predecessors were engaged in greater law breaking. It's hard to measure these things than Trump did. I mean, Trump didn't do anything like George W. Bush's commander-in-chief overrides with regard to the torture statute or the warrantless wiretapping stuff. He did not engage in extremely broad, on nearly the same scale, in extremely broad uses of the take care power to stretch delegated authority to regulate in ways that went far beyond what statutory delegations authorized in the immigration context and the health context and the like. I mean, so I don't believe, I'm not saying that Trump didn't violate any laws. He did in some instances. But in talking about criminal investigation afterwards, I mean, one of my points was I don't think he's violated the obstruction of justice statute, and I don't think the main sin was law violation. Point one. Point two, we expressly accept, we characterize him as a classic demagogue. I think that's exactly the right way to think about Trump. And so one of the hardest questions, I didn't mention this in my introduction, but one of the best objections to our book, and we address it in the book, is, aren't you really just objecting to democracy? Because if the American people want to elect a president who behaves this way, who are you to argue that he shouldn't behave this way? I mean, in effect, I'm not sure if that's the claim you're making, but I think that was the most powerful objection I can think of to our project. Let me just tell you how we put it in the book. I'm just going to read you a few sentences, if that's okay. One objection to this project is that Trump's harsh rhetoric and bad manners don't matter. On this view, he's a Democrat. So this is after we've acknowledged that he's basically a classic demagogue. Mm-hmm. On this view, he is a democratically elected president who ran and won on a platform that claimed that establishment institutions were corrupt, and he pledged to change those institutions dramatically. His defiance of norms in order to weaken the press and governmental institutions and his other behaviors earlier amount to nothing more in substance than executing the wishes of the electorate. This view accepts that Trump is rude, brash, shameless, and ill-mannered in executing this mandate, and it maintains that the institutions Trump was elected to change, especially the press and the executive branch bureaucracy, have made clear in their reactions to Trump that they hold precisely the biased establishment views that Trump was elected to redress. According to this view, the reforms we suggest to buck up the norms and institutions governing presidential behavior are undemocratic. I think that's the most powerful critique of my whole project, and our answer might seem weak, but it's the ground on which I stand. And I do think it's an American's prerogative to elect a president who is norm violative, not rule violative, not law violative, but norm violative. And in fact, I'll just say this: we've gotten into the habit of thinking in the last 4 years. I haven't, but many people have. That norm violations are always bad. I mean, it's norm violations are often good and often a path of progress. And American history is full of examples of that as well. And frankly, in some respects, some of Trump's norm violations, I think, were useful. I mean, not everything he did was horrific. So, basically, we defend by saying the American people are allowed to elect whomever they want, and that the American people can, including norm-breaking presidents. And if over time they continue to elect such people, then our reforms aren't going to be very useful. But we think that the types of reforms we're talking about, which are designed to enhance the public trust, to enhance confidence that the president is acting with integrity, to ensure that the public interest and not his personal concerns are being furthered, that's our normative commitment. As we put it here, perhaps not very persuasive, the principles defended in this book are that the presidency is a public trust, that presidents should not be permitted to abuse the powers of office to advance their private interests or to politicize law enforcement, but should instead be accountable to Congress and the people through rigorous transparency and other mechanisms. And we explain how we derive those. And so all I can say to you is this is kind of my normative stand, that the principles here are the principles that we think are the right ones for a demagogic president. I mean, I have a hard time. While you can argue about the way Trump treats the press, we can argue about that, and we have some suggestions about that. That doesn't bother me nearly as much as the president of the United States lining his pockets through his manipulation of foreign policy. It doesn't bother me nearly as much as the president trying to, and this is a tricky one, but trying to manipulate law enforcement to hide criminality, which is what I think happened in some instances. So it's a fair critique, the one you're getting at. We acknowledge that he's a demagogue, and the critique that we're being anti-democratic is an entirely fair one. We addressed it just as I told you, but a lot of people won't be convinced by that.
Thank you, Jack. Mark Landy, your cat may ask the next question.
The cat wants to ask the question, but I'm going to go first. Kimberly Strassel had an article in today's Wall Street Journal that disturbed me a lot. I mean, I want Biden to be put in office. I think most of the accusations of fraud per se are either trivial or beside the point, but there is I think, a serious problem, which is ballot harvesting. I mean, the Australian ballot was a great idea, and forcing people to go to the polls, of course, is a great protection of the Australian ballot. First of all, I'm wondering if you think I'm overstating my concern, and two, what should we do? If you don't think so, what should we do about it?
So I really wasn't joking when I said at the outset that I don't know. I'm not an election law expert. I haven't looked at ballot harvesting. I just don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether it's a real danger or not. I'm just ignorant about it. I mean, you know, I read the front pages of the newspapers, but I just don't have an informed view. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Rita Koganzin of University of Virginia.
So you started to answer my question actually in your previous answer, but I guess I just want to press you a little bit further on this. I mean, the distinction between law and norm, the norm is supposed to be more flexible and more able to change to sort of fill in the gap between law, but also to be more nimble than law. So I guess I'm wondering whether you think there are any norms that Trump broke that were worth breaking, because it would seem to be by definition the case that some norms have to become outdated at some point.
That's a great question. Let me just say one preliminary thing, and then I'll try to think of an example. So there are a couple of reasons why we have norms rather than law. One is precisely as you say, for flexibility. We recognize that these principles may be subject to contextual change, that maybe we should make them easier to change, and that if the person who's governed by the norm is willing to accept the cost of the norm change, that then, you know, maybe that's a good thing. But there's another reason, and it's one I mentioned also. Sometimes we have to regulate the presidency by norms just because legal regulation is not possible because of the Constitution. So let me think. I mean, I'm sure that Trump has broken some norms he broke a whole bunch of norms about, you know, at the political level in the Republican Party that I admired. You know, you're not supposed to question whether the Iraq War was a good thing and whether the Republican Party's militaristic commitment is a good thing. So at that level, he broke a lot of norms that I think are admirable and probably push the party in a better, more thoughtful direction. I'm having a hard time thinking of norms that he broke. If anyone's got examples, I'd love to consider them, but norms he broke in office that I admire and think push the presidency or the country in a better direction. Do you have some examples?
Well, my one question is not an obvious example. I mean, you could go either way on this, but what about tweeting? I mean, he's certainly the first president who's used social media in the way that he's used it. It has had an enormous effect on the presidency and then on the public in turn. What about that norm?
Yeah. So I don't know if he broke a norm there, because I mean, there's been a long-term trend, which people on this call know about, with the rhetorical presidency of presidents using advances in technology to try to circumvent the press and reach the people directly. Bush and Obama used social media, and Obama was using Twitter, and there's been a progression in that. I think what he did there was a natural progression. What he did in the content of his tweets. So I don't have any trouble with the president tweeting about whatever he wants. I mean, I have no principled objection to his tweeting at all. But I'm not sure that was that the act of tweeting so often, it was more of an extension of a practice. It was a natural evolution of a practice rather than a kind of change in a practice. The content of his tweets were often norm violative, but I don't have any particular problem with his tweeting. I don't think technology is constantly changing, and it's usually been changing in a direction that has favored presidents. I mean, going back throughout the 20th century. Roosevelt's fireside chats and the like. So I mean, in theory, I think that, but I just can't think of any great examples of norm violations, but pushed us in a good direction. But that's not to say there aren't some. I wish I'd thought about that question earlier. It's a good question.
Lior.
Thanks. So my question is, it seems to me that any reforms, if done through the law, presuppose some degree of support from the American public. And I guess my question is, what's your sense of where the center of gravity is in the American electorate right now on the question of presidential power? I don't hear Democrats saying that the lesson to be learned from the last 4 years is that the president is too strong as an institution. What I hear is, yes, now it's our turn, right? Biden has already vowed on his first day in office to do all these executive actions. And it seems to me that both sides in the American politics today have accepted this kind of logic of Caesarism, where the question is just whose Caesar should rule. And not to compare Trump with Obama, but Obama too was a norm breaker, right? I mean, this whole kind of if Congress won't act, I will, the use of unilateral executive orders and things like that. And it seems to me, to kind of build on maybe a point that Frances Lee made in a book of hers a few years ago, if one of the facts that operating behind the scenes here is that the parties are very evenly divided. Americans are very evenly divided. And that means that both parties have structural incentives to think with a view to winning the next election. So there is no kind of long-term incentive to think about how do we reduce the power of the presidency or constrain it. So I'm curious just to get your sense of where the American public is, and if you're informed. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think that the level at which you discussed it is way too abstract with respect. And some issues, I mean, the issues you're talking about, I actually don't think Obama was a norm breaker and saying, if Congress won't do it, I will. That was exactly the logic of George W. Bush and many presidents before him. That's been an increasing logic of presidents going back decades and decades and decades. I think that I don't see that as norm breaking, although maybe some of it instances were extreme. And so there are many elements of executive power, and I'm just going to draw some distinctions. So on some of the things we propose, I mean, it's not just a question of where the American people are in executive power. It's where are the American people on financial conflict of interest with the presidency. On that question, there's about 75% support for tax disclosure and not having presidential financial conflicts of interest. Where are the American people worried about foreign interference in elections? 75% are very worried. Those are two areas, core areas, especially the conflict of interest and tax disclosure stuff, where it's easy to imagine there would be reform. On the question of the pardon power, I don't see Joe Biden going to the mat on, there's already reforms like this in Congress, and there's interest in Congress. I don't see Joseph Biden going to the mat to prevent Congress from saying that certain presidential actions with the pardon power are illegal when you're trying to engage in obstruction of justice and the like. And I can go through all of the reforms, and a lot of them, it's not useful in my judgment to talk about executive power generally. And on a lot of stuff, there's going to be consensus, and a lot of stuff it's going to be hard. And then a lot of stuff, and I'm going to get to the issues you're talking about, are going to be really hard. And I agree with you. So the issues that you're really talking about, and you're absolutely right. And I wrote this the other day, we're about to see the logic of Joe Biden is that he's going to come in the first day and start doing very aggressive executive orders, interpreting delegated power very aggressively. Everyone in the country, except myself and about 3 other people, best I can tell, are going to flip about their views on executive power because of whose ox is being gored. And the Supreme Court, the more conservative Supreme Court, is going to do a more aggressive job of keeping that in check, is my prediction. But I agree with you on the logic of certain and very important executive powers, and there's a reason why we didn't talk about this much in our book. Now, to get to that, on the administrative state and on the president exercise and on Congress having delegated presidents enormous power, and on Congress basically being dysfunctional and not exercising its responsibilities, every president that wants to get something accomplished, as every president does, has increasingly turned, and it's really not new, but has increasingly turned to the tools of executive power, administrative regulations, executive orders, interpretations, and the like, to achieve their desired outcome. All enhanced, by the way, through doctrines of deference by the Supreme Court that used to be championed by conservatives, like the Chevron doctrine and the like, which are now being questioned. So on that score, I don't think that there's, it's interesting because on that score, I don't think that there's an appetite for reform, or at least not any, not a kind of swell of reform, because every party wants that power once they're in power. The remarkable thing about Trump is he didn't do that very much. Trump was not great at governing. He lost an unusually high percentage of his administrative regulatory cases in court because he simply had incompetent people crafting the regulations and defending them, less so defending them in court than in crafting them. So I think the logic of Caesarism, as you described it, holds for administrative state and delegated power issues. I don't think part 3 of our book is about those issues. We talk about war powers, we talk about emergency powers. Not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. I don't think you're going to see any major robust action on Congress to reassert itself with regard to delegated authority in the administrative state, unless the Supreme Court forces them to. So in sum, on a large chunk of executive power issues, which we didn't address in this book because it's really just a separate problem and not one on which I think reform is very likely, I agree with you. But then there are a whole bunch of other things where I think that there is a consensus, and where Trump was being, in my judgment, a bad actor. And that's largely, but not exclusively, what we focused on.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question to Lior's. If you had your way 5 years ago and all the reforms that you proposed, all of them had been implemented by the time Trump came into office, and Trump had behaved in the exact same way, what crimes would he have committed, and what would that have led to? Would he have been impeached? Would it have been clear that the Republicans would all have to be on board with impeachment, otherwise they lose legitimacy? What does this do to shift the?
That's a great question. It's a great counterfactual. So Trump would not have been able to stonewall on his taxes. He would not have been able to set up the sham blind trust that he did and keep control over his activities. He would not be able to maintain his investments and receive income from foreign state interests. Some of his pardons and some of his actions would have been so. The things that were, so Mueller listed 10 episodes of possible criminal obstruction of justice. I think under current law, probably none of those violate the law, as bad or as you might think they are. It would take a fine-grained analysis, but many of those would have been crimes, or arguably crimes under some of our proposals. Some of Trump's actions on the pardon power would have at least been criminally suspect, especially with regard to Stone and maybe some of the upcoming ones. Again, this is getting in the weeds. These reforms, I should tell you, in case you're inclined to buy the book, this is a dense book with lots of legal analysis. It's not like my Hoffa book, which was meant to be readable. We tried to make it readable, but it's hard to do when you're doing serious sort of detailed legal analysis. But we have a lot of reforms for the special counsel, some of which would enhance the special counsel's powers, but others of which would have enhanced the attorney general's powers and would have made some of the things Mueller did not possible. So it's not clear that Mueller's report would have taken the shape that it did. I don't think it would have. It would have been smaller and the investigation would have been narrower. If some of our reforms are in place, I seriously doubt if there ever would have been a counterintelligence investigation of the president. I seriously doubt that the criminal investigation of the president would have taken the arc that it did. I think a lot of that stuff happened because of inadequate guidance and sort of norm violation by the bureaucrats that we've tried to fix. And finally, I'll stop on this one. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head because I had never thought about this question before, even though I should have. The Trump Tower episode probably would have been a reportable event. They would have had to have reported it to the FBI, and if that agreement had been made, which it wasn't, it would have been clearly criminal. So those are some suggestions, some ideas. Which is not to say, would Trump have acted any differently other than the tax disclosure and the conflict of interest stuff? Perhaps not. And this is an important point, I think. The reforms don't stop the president from speaking in any way he wants. The question is, when you have a president that is clearly, expressly, and intentionally institution destroying, how do you maintain the operation of the institutions and the integrity of the institutions as much as you can in the face of that? That's kind of the project. Anyway, that's a great question. Those are some of the answers.
So, but if Congress wouldn't go along with criminal indictments, Congress would really lose legitimacy with stricter rules. That was my other question. They would have had to impeach him.
you know what they ended up impeaching him for in Ukraine was not obviously a crime. That they didn't, I mean, and it wasn't really claimed to be a crime. It was an abuse of power. You don't have to commit a federal crime to be impeached. So maybe, I mean, I think impeachment was just driven all by politics, obviously. So I'm not sure anything would have changed there.
Susan Shell of Boston College.
I can't hear.
Yeah,
Can you
unmute.
hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you. I really do look forward to reading your book. It's as best I can. I read comics.
It's not that bad. I just don't want you to think it's a novel. It's not a novel.
But I did want to complicate a little bit. I'll push back about the demagogue analysis, because it seems to me that we're not Athens, and the people in the United States is a very different entity in some ways than the people of Athens. I mean, it's a kind of construction. I mean, we're very diverse. To some extent, the American people is an invention of Abraham Lincoln, or he had a lot to do with our envisioning ourselves and re-envisioning ourselves as a single people. And it seems to me that one of Trump's worst aspects of the Trump presidency lay in his dividing the people, not representing them, or representing a certain sliver or a 40% or whatever it is, where there is really probably much more commonality and overlap, and exaggerating kind of the divisions within the people. And so I'm wondering whether the excess is in that direction. So I'll give you one example. That we're not so much a democracy supposedly as a liberal democracy, which means that a regime of the people is mitigated by a regime of individual rights. But each part of this, this polarity emphasizes different rights, gun rights on the one hand, abortion rights on the other. And so each is in a way fighting for rights and fighting for the people, but they end up talking about very different things. Is there some way in which the reforms you're suggesting speak to the particular problems of polarization and the fragmentation of our sense of being a united people?
So it's a great question. We talk about it in the book. We don't address it. We assume it. It's not part of our reform program. We assume a deeply fragmented polity, and we assume that we'll continue to have a fragmented polity. It's kind of an assumption of our analysis. Our analysis doesn't change that. It doesn't purport to address that issue. What it purports to try to do is, given a fragmented polity, given alternate factual universes that we're increasingly descending into, given a breakdown in kind of institutional norms, not just in the presidency, but throughout Washington and perhaps in the country, I mean, what can we do in the presidency to help it to operate well in this environment? What can we do in the interim if we have a presidency that doesn't have that characteristic to help it operate well in that environment? That is the project of the book. And let me say candidly, and I say this in the book, at some point, these institutional reforms, ultimately, when you get down to the bottom of why these things work or don't work, country, or it's ultimately because the country shares a set of norms. I mean, at a lot of points, people don't appreciate this. When Trump was being at his craziest about firing Mueller and the like, it was the Republicans who were in the can for him who stepped up and said, you really can't do that. And if things get much worse in terms of everyone acting in their crass perceived tribal self-interest, and we don't have any residual kind of consensus across tribes, then I don't think any of these reforms can work. So basically my answer to your question is, we assume what you're talking about, but don't purport to fix it, because I don't know how to fix it and it's not part of this project. And if what you're talking about grows bad enough, then none of these reforms, or few of the reforms, will work. So that's about all I can say, I'm afraid.
So Andy, and then Heather, and then Shep.
Jack, thanks so much for doing this. My question.
Thank you, Andy.
My question, in a way, is a follow-up to Anna's, which is, what is your judgment now in retrospect of what led to the Mueller investigation, the Mueller investigation and report, and the criticisms of it from, for example, like Mark Landy already mentioned her today, Kimberly Strassel.
Yeah.
Those types of critics.
Yeah.
So what is your bottom line judgment?
Yeah, my bottom line judgment is, and we have a whole chapter on this, is that there were enormous mistakes made. But actually, we have several chapters. This is part of the book that hasn't gotten much attention, but this is a co-authored book written with Bob Bauer, and we are critical of elements of the Mueller investigation, and we are critical of elements of the investigation of the Trump campaign by the FBI and the Justice Department. There were a lot of, and by the way, we rely heavily in our criticisms of the FBI on 4 Inspector General reports from the Department of Justice that were deeply critical of the way, in various ways, that the Trump campaign and the president, well, more the Trump campaign than the president himself. So look, there's a lot there. I'll just give you my bottom lines. What happened? I mean, Trump was a discombobulating figure in 2016. He was saying things that sounded strangely pro-Russian to a lot of people in this country. The FBI has in its DNA, at the bottom of what it worries about most is Russian counterintelligence, Russian spies, Russian infiltration. From their perspective, and they may have panicked, but we would have chastised them if they weren't aggressive. From their perspective, it looked, with all of these campaign officials, with all these Russian contacts and the president talking the way they did, there was an issue there. And my complaints about it were not that there wasn't something to look at. The problem is, and we talk about this in the book, the problem is that in the context of the FBI, the successor, the institution that J. Edgar Hoover used to run, examining a presidential candidate during a presidential campaign at the heart of the democratic process, you have to be completely cross all your T's and dot all of your I's. And that did not happen. And it didn't happen in large part. I mean, our main diagnosis of the problem is that inside the government, there should have been rules about this, and there weren't rules. There weren't rules with any guidance to them. That I think with the rules we put in place, which are the right rules, a lot of this stuff wouldn't have happened. That's before you even get to the FISA problems, which are manifest and very, very, very hard to explain. So, I mean, and then the Mueller investigation, I mean, I'm a deep admirer of Bob Mueller. And I understand, I have not read the Weissman book, but I understand that he been pilloried by the left for not being aggressive enough. And that was a very tough investigation because of the president's behavior. Whatever you think about what Mueller did, there was a lot of stuff going on every side. But I think Mueller didn't follow the regulations that he should have in many ways. We talk about this in the book. So, I mean, I'm not a champion of what happened in those investigations. On the other hand, I don't think anyone was personally corrupt. I mean, I don't think that anyone was, I mean, I don't think that's the nature of the problem. I think the problem is mostly structural. And so that's basically the way I see it. I'm happy to follow up, but I've gone on for a bit.
I guess the main question that I have is whether you see that conspiratorial kind of wrongdoing as opposed to what you describe in the book as the absence of the framework for doing what Anna and her question is suggesting. So do you see the actors as having been corrupt and conspiratorial in the way that some Wall Street Journal accounts and others, National Review, have?
No, I don't, but I tend not in any direction, any political direction. I mean, I tend not to attribute bad faith or corrupt motives to government officials. It's very easy to do. I was in some of those very difficult positions where people ascribe corrupt motives to me. I defended John Yoo when he was up in the Office of Professional Responsibility Investigation for acting in bad faith. I mean, I disagree with some of his opinions on things, but I don't think he acted. He was in a difficult spot, and he may have made some mistakes. I think that's exactly what happened in these other investigations. I mean, I'm not saying there's that lawyer who may have changed the evidence. I'm not saying everyone acted virtuously. I'm just saying I don't think there was corruption. Now, is it an accident that all of these mistakes went against Trump? I don't think it is. But I attribute that basically to, and I don't want to be naive about this. I'm not naive about the FBI, I can assure you. I think those are mistakes that were attributed to a combination of a lack of guidance and unbelievable fear and overreaction. You know, it's actually not disanalogous from the Bush administration, the early Bush administration. It's the same set of factors. Huge fear, misperception of the problem because of the fear, and overreaction in the legal actions. And it's very easy for us, by the way, after the fact, that I'm very sensitive to this because I had some of these jobs. It's very easy for all of us. And again, I was critical of these things, but it's very easy for all of us to, after the fact, judge these and attribute it to corruption. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I don't believe that happened in these cases. And I haven't seen evidence of it.
Jack, thank you so much. And I'll second Harvey's endorsement of reading your books on both the Bush administration and Obama administration, where you bring that very helpful way of looking at these matters to bear. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Heather.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I apologize, there's a very loud leaf blower outside. There may be
It's okay, I can hear you.
I wanted to invite you to elaborate on the topic of emergency powers and war powers and how your book suggests those ought to be reformed, with the caveat that, as you mentioned in response to one of the previous questions, that may be one of the least likely reforms to actually happen. And so to elaborate on that and to ask you how or whether, if your reforms had been implemented, whether any of Trump's actions would have been different, or whether he would have been more constrained, or whether this is more a forward-looking set of reforms that wouldn't have changed Trump's actions.
Right. Great question. So let me just say, his background, Trump did some scary things with regard to nuclear weapons, you know, kind of tweet threats against the Korean dictator. Which, given Trump's mercurial personality and everything else, justifiably led to some concerns. May have been very effective, but I don't know, but it was also very frightening. But with that caveat, Trump was not, and we say this in the book, Trump was not on the aggressive end of using war powers. I don't think that he was as aggressive in war powers, either in fact or in his stretching the law, as his two predecessors, Barack Obama and George W. Bush, in different ways. So the presidential powers reforms, as we say, are, you know, Trump continued some of the things that we're talking about, but this was less than some of the other reforms. This is not a kind of stark react. And as you say, it's a longer term issue, and I think it's a longer term problem. There are a lot of reforms, and I think, let me talk about some that I think are plausible, and then I'll talk about some that I think aren't plausible. We're in the 20th year of a war against non-state actor terrorists that's taking place in a dozen or so countries, or maybe a lot more depending on how you count, based on a legal authorization from 2001 that has no textual connection to what's going on now. And the process whereby the war has morphed in so many directions, both geographically and the nature of the enemy and the types of weapons we use. Congress has gone along with all of this. It's perfectly legal, because even if this 2001 authorization that was authorized the response to 9/11, even if that didn't support our fight against Al-Qaeda now, or Al-Shabaab, or whomever in Somalia, or ISIS in other parts of the Middle East, even if that statute doesn't authorize that, Congress has not had the courage or the fortitude to actually step up and guide and state what the authorization to use force is. It lets the president decide what the scope of the war is, and then it appropriates on the sly for it. So one of the proposals that that there's been bipartisan interest in is to scrap these old AUMFs, these old authorizations to use force, to describe the nature of the wars that exist, to acknowledge that this war is not going to end anytime soon. We can call it a war, but it is a war technically within legal doctrine. And to come up with a process for Congress can be more engaged in at least being notified about when the enemy changes and having a role in that. And also we think, and this is controversial, but I believe it's the right thing, that there should be a sunset clause on these authorizations, that the Congress of the United States should have to engage in an endless war to approve it every, you pick a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And that it shouldn't just be left to the discretion of the president to conduct the war the way he thinks should be conducted for decades. So we have some other proposals for cleaning up the AUMFs. That's conceivable. I mean, it's conceivable that will happen for a whole bunch of reasons. That won't affect what's going on now. It won't affect anything about the nature of the war now, but it will be return it, put it on a more solid constitutional foundation, and it will force Congress to be involved going forward, which I think is very important. So that's one cluster of reforms. Then there's another cluster of reforms about the War Powers Resolution, which is a hopeless statute. The President of the United States has, I mean, if you read the Office of Legal Counsel opinion supporting war powers, one of which I am the author of, you'll find that the executive branch has, over time, written opinions that justify ever broader and broader uses of force under Article 2 without congressional authorization. We have a whole bunch of mechanisms for trying to cabin that, and the one line in the sand we draw, which won't happen, but I think should happen, is that the President of the United States should not be able, on his own authority under Article 2, to engage in purely humanitarian interventions that don't have a self-defense rationale at all. It's remarkable that my colleague Bob Bauer went along with this. Indeed, I think it was his idea as much as mine, since he was the legal architect of the Libya operation in 2011, which we discuss in the book. So there's that set of reforms and other sort of smaller things on the War Powers Resolution, which I don't expect to be efficacious or to happen. And then we have a complicated chapter on nuclear weapons. And to make a long story short and oversimplifying, the current understanding is the president can use these weapons in his discretion. And that has thought to have been justified under our nuclear deterrence policy. And again, to make a long story short, but I'm happy to flesh it out if you want, we want to avoid situations. We want to try to maintain the logic of our nuclear deterrence, which is that the president has plenary full control to use nuclear weapons in the face of an incoming attack. And even, and I'm paraphrasing our nuclear deterrence posture statement, I'm not going to get the language exactly right, but in the face of an imminent threat to a vital national security interest, absent those circumstances, we don't think the president should be able to use nuclear weapons. So what we're worried about and trying to prevent is the situations that people worried about with Trump, which is that he would, out of pique, decide he wanted to nuke Syria or North Korea for no great, in a way that wouldn't necessarily be lawful and wouldn't necessarily be justified by our nuclear deterrence policy. So we try to come up with a way to regulate that. Again, this is not going to happen for a whole bunch of reasons, but we argue that it should. So that's the war power stuff in a nutshell. If you have any follow-ups.
We have just one quick follow-up. How would imminent threat be determined?
Well, I mean, it would be determined by the president, but the idea is, let me give you the exact language. I'm just reading you language. I'm going to try to find the language from the nuclear deterrence posture of the commonalities of the nuclear deterrence posture between the Obama and Trump administrations, if I can find it here. The decision would be the president's, obviously, but I'm not going to be able to find the exact language at hand, but the decision would be the president's, obviously, and that's a weakness in the proposal. But some uses of force that Trump threatened and considered would clearly not have satisfied that. And the idea is not to stop Trump, but the military is not allowed to carry out an illegal command. The idea is, and this is a very dangerous idea, as it and we talk about this at length because it gets to the teeth of deterrence policy, where you want to have a sure and quick and reliable way for the president to order the use of nuclear weapons in a second or in a few minutes. But the idea is that an obviously unlawful command would not be carried out. That's the idea, or at least that there would be sand in the joints for an extremely irresponsible use of nuclear weapons that didn't have any plausible justification without mucking up the plausible circumstances in which you want to use nuclear weapons. But it's just, as I've just described the problem, you see what the problem is. And we grapple with it in the book in some detail. And that's my shorthand answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have Shep, and then Amy, and then Adam White, and then Bob Faulkner. Shep, take it away.
Thank you. I have one short question and one longer one that builds on Heather's. The short question is, you have laid out, I think, very strong reasons for not prosecuting Trump for things he did in office. One of the greatest, in my mind, one of the worst violations of informal norms that he perpetrated was this lock it up stuff, which I really find horrendous, and I hope the Democrats don't.
Yeah, I agree.
Pursue. But my question is, I mean, what about things he did before office and things he does when he leaves office? Because my assumption is he was a crook before he was president, and he'll be a crook when he leaves the presidency. So I assume that that is subject to ordinary rules, unaffected by his role as president. So that's my quick question. My other question is on emergency power, and you talked about foreign policy and authorization of use of military force. During the Trump administration, we learned that there are a lot of old statutes that have lots of emergency power declarations, not particularly connected to foreign policy. Is it possible that Congress will try to go back and try to clean up some of those, or is that something that is probably politically unlikely?
Okay, great questions. So I'm glad you raised the first one because I talk about it in the book and I should have mentioned it. Yes, Trump can be prosecuted for acts committed before he became president. I have no objection to that. There are two investigations going on right now, one in New York State and New York federal court. I think Trump will pardon himself and everyone involved in the federal court operation, but the state court one can and should proceed in my view. So I'm talking about criminal liability and investigation for acts in office. And that means that acts after office are also subject to, of course, to criminal prosecution. And there's been a lot of speculation. I just wrote a piece on a lot of speculation that Trump is going to not be able to constrain himself from selling national security secrets, of which he has a lot. And he's inclined to sell things that are valuable, especially when he has big debts. And so that's one plausible. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying it's possible that it would happen. And I see no objection to prosecuting a president for crimes committed after he leaves office. On the second point, emergency powers are a mess. There are, I think the count is 133 statutes that authorize the president to have some sort of emergency power. The vast majority, the great irony, well, the vast majority of emergency powers that are exercised do not involve what we would naturally think of as emergencies. The emergencies last forever. The emergency that Jimmy Carter declared in response to the takeover of the American embassy in Iran is still in force, as are emergencies. You know, they've been modified and changed, but approved by every president ever since. And the big statute is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. It's the one that basically gives the president on his basically unreviewable determination of I don't have the language exactly right, but a threat from outside the United States, just enormous discretion to affect international economic relations, including with American companies. So this is a large problem, I think, and it's based. And here's why the problem happened: when Congress gave the president these massive unreviewable power, these massive powers, they put in place something called the National Emergencies Act, which set up a process. And this was a time, IEPA was enacted at a time before Chadha, the Supreme Court decision that invalidated the legislative veto. So many of these emergency powers Congress had control over because they could exercise legislative vetoes if the president acted irresponsibly or if they went on forever. So they give the president all this power with ability constraint of the legislative veto, and then the Supreme Court in 1981 declares the legislative veto unconstitutional. And suddenly the president is given all these powers that basically Congress can't control anymore. So I do think that there's bipartisan interest in Congress. In the main bill is by Senator Lee, a Republican. There's bipartisan interest in Congress in bringing some reform to the emergency powers, but they're the main, putting sunset clauses on them, which I think would be a good idea, tightening them up, saying that they can't go on for 30 years, they can't go on for so long without affirmative congressional approval and the like. But even Senator Lee's bill excises or carves out IEPA, which is really where the problem is. All these other things, I think, paled by comparison to the enormous discretion the president has under IEPA. We have some proposals on that, but I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen. It's a power that the president it's a core presidential tool in foreign policy that the Biden administration will not want to give up. And I'm not even sure Congress wants to give it up. I mean, they don't want the responsibility of having to engage in a more fine-grained way in giving the president authority to meet threats. So that's my basic view.
Amy.
Yes, I wanted to thank you for your public service. I'm a private citizen and just an observer of politics generally, but I admire people who hold public office. So I wanted to begin you by thanking you for that. And I'm also, I also agree with you on the importance of upholding norms. But I do think that if we're going to insist that other people uphold norms, we have to uphold norms ourselves. And in the current situation, I have a very particular question about the use of the term president-elect in contested elections, and whether or not we should be encouraging ourselves and our friends to be using this term when it does not seem to apply. It doesn't seem to be the regular constitutional norm that we've followed in the past.
Is that the question?
That's the question.
Yeah. So I'm not encouraging anyone to say anything, but I think it's perfectly natural, and it has been the natural practice, that when it is apparent that one party there's a process, and I agree with you, and I don't have any problem with this process working out, and I think it will work itself out. The president of the United States is allowed to challenge in the courts whatever he cares to challenge. He doesn't have any serious claims. The process of the electors won't actually cast their ballots, I think, until December 14th, and then Congress certifies that at a later date. I mean, you're absolutely right that that's the point, I suppose, at which a president is officially the president-elect, but it's not the norm to wait until then to make that determination. So I'm not sure what norms you're talking about. If this were if the election were more contested and if there were plausible claims, I mean, back in 2000, when there was a very, very, very close election, and when in one state and the outcome of the election turned on it, that was more plausible. But I don't feel strongly about whether you want to call Biden, about whether one should call Biden president-elect or not, or ostensible president-elect, or the person who appeared to have won the election, but we'll know for sure in 2 weeks. I don't feel strongly about that at all. And I don't understand why people are worked up about it one way or the other, frankly.
Well, you don't think it's important to follow the constitutional norms and to...
As I just said, the norm you described has not been the norm.
It has been the norm in contested elections.
Okay, well, then the question is this a contested election?
It is until the court cases have been decided, are they not? I don't understand the process.
I mean,
otherwise.
Listen, as I say, I don't feel strongly what you call Biden. I don't have a strong view about it. I don't think that, I just don't have a strong view about it. And if you think it's, I don't think you can identify a norm of not calling the person who seems and appears to have won the election with no plausible argument that he didn't, president-elect. But I also don't feel strongly about it at all. If you want to not call him the president-elect, that's fine. I don't feel strongly about it.
Well, so do you think that his advisors should encourage him not to claim that title before it's constitutionally appropriate?
As I said, I just don't have a view about it. I don't think it's important.
Thank you.
Adam, you're next.
Hi, Jack. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Adam.
I know you've bracketed the terms of the inquiry here in the book, knowing that to try to solve all of government would require maybe a couple of books. But I'm just curious, as the conversation wraps up, you've referred to the other parts of government. I'm just curious. The House and the Senate and the courts all have different powers and serve different constituencies. Of those three, whose absence do you think is the most deeply felt in the conflicts you've been thinking through, or whose absence is, or whose self-restraint most exacerbates the issues you've discussed in the book?
I just think, I don't purport to be an expert on this. I'm not a political, and I don't study deeply. But it seems to me that if you point, and I don't know what the cause is of what I'm about to describe. There are many, but the actor in art that is underperforming, and that if it performed better would make every other institution act better and perform better and more in its constitutional functions, is Congress. Congress doesn't legislate anymore. It delegates legislation to the executive. It doesn't do oversight anymore. It delegates oversight to the executive in inspectors general and reporting requirements, and in private cause of action, it's to private parties. Congress doesn't update laws. It delegates that to the executive branch. Congress doesn't exercise its responsibilities under the Declare War Clause and its other military powers. Instead of overseeing and approving the nature of the wars that are being fought in our name, it quietly tucks away approvals and appropriation statutes and doesn't address the hard issues because it doesn't want accountability for it. So Congress is a serious problem. I don't know how to fix it. Some people have said, well, your reforms depend on Congress, and that's true, but they're all designed basically on the assumption that Congress is not going to engage in continuing oversight, and that one-shot reforms can be very useful. But does that answer your question? I think it's clearly that's the deficient institution in our government. And look, the reason, to go back to an earlier question, I think it was by Leor, I can't remember, the reason, I don't like presidents wielding executive power in the regulatory context as aggressively as President Obama did, or President Biden will, or in some respects, President Bush did. President Trump, not so much, but in some cases, is because there is a need in some circumstances for changes in the law, to update laws to meet changes in society. Presidents do have responsibility, and they are in fact held accountable for what happens, even if it's not their responsibility to legislate. I think a lot of the aggressiveness in the executive branch is a result of failure in Congress. So I just think that's the most problematic institution, but I don't have, not my jurisdiction. And I haven't read any great solutions either. I mean, it's a deep problem, I think.
Thanks, Jack.
And the final question goes to Bob Faulkner.
My question concerns not the presidency, but your wonderful paper on the arc of conservative legal theory. You conclude that by suggesting that originalism, which you tacitly, I think, praise a lot, nevertheless has come to a kind of hollowness, or a certain kind of problematic character at the present time. And I can see now that you're understanding of the presidency itself, as well as the courts, depends upon that original teaching. How would you supplement or correct originalism as it's presently understood?
Boy, that's a tough task in 3 minutes. Well, let me just say, sorry. I don't have, so I am only, Scalia described himself, how did he, Adam help me here? He described himself as not a fragile originalist, but a
faint-hearted originalist.
Faint-hearted originalist. Scalia himself described himself as a faint-hearted originalist. And I'm a faint-hearted originalist. I mean, I think originalism and textualism is obviously where one should start in constitutional interpretation. But I think as a descriptive theory of our constitutional law, it's not really helpful as in all of its, or as a normative theory. It's not a very useful theory. The problem I have with originalism, my basic jurisprudential commitments, for what it's worth, are more Thayerian, i.e., courts should stay out of the business of the democracy as much as possible. And originalism has been a force for the good, I think, in general in constitutional law, but it's also often just totally ignored by conservatives when they want to achieve certain ends. And they're more and more aggressive in achieving those ends, largely libertarian ones, in striking down legislation. And I think originalism just doesn't answer a lot of questions, and originalists don't have good answers to questions like, or great answers to questions about liquidation of constitutional meaning through practice, the role of precedent, and the like. So I've never been a card-carrying originalist, and I'm not now, although I think it's clearly the right way to think about the beginning of constitutional interpretation. But I'm not a constitutional theorist. I'm sorry. I don't, other than being, my basic prejudice or disposition is I want courts out of our lives. And so, less involvement by courts, more deference to the legislature and the like is my basic view. But I'm not sure that rises to the level of a theory.
Well, thank you, Jack, very much for the wonderful discussion which you both led and brought forth.
Thank you so much, Harvey. I appreciate the time. Thank you all very much for your good questions.